What would you do if, on your own son's birthday, right in front of his friends, he looked you in the eye and said the cruelest thing a father could ever hear? "I just want you out of my life." I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I smiled, walked out of that party as if nothing had happened. But the moment the door closed behind me, I knew this would be the last birthday gift I ever gave him, and it would change everything forever. The noise inside Ethan's apartment stacked in layers: bass from a Bluetooth speaker, laughter ricocheting off glass and polished concrete, the wet sweep of city air every time someone opened the balcony door. I stood just inside the entry, trying to catch his eye, a small wrapped box balanced in my hand like something fragile and out of time. I'd pictured this moment a dozen different ways on the drive over. None of them looked like this. Me, half invisible in a crowd of people my son chose because they were loud enough to drown out whatever he didn't want to hear. He spotted me across the room the way you spot a fire alarm you don't plan to test. No change in his expression, no lift of the chin that meant he was glad I'd come. He was 28 today, all easy grin and curated swagger, a craft beer in one hand and an audience in the other. Someone shoved a mic at him after a toast about making it to 28 without getting domesticated, and the room laughed in the way rooms do when they want to be on the right side of a joke. He took the mic, let the laughter crest and fade, and turned toward the living room where I was still standing beside a credenza crowded with empty glasses. "Save the speeches," he said, the corner of his mouth hitching, "and forget the gift." A few heads turned toward me. He liked that. The smallest pause, just long enough to make sure he had the room. "Honestly, the only thing I want from you, Dad, is for you to disappear from my life." There are sentences that do their work quietly over years, and there are sentences that cut clean, all at once. This one was a blade. I felt the room tilt and then steady around me, like the building had taken a breath. Somebody snorted. A couple of his friends did that sympathetic wince laugh, like they weren't sure where to put their eyes. The blonde woman tucked against his side, Samantha, the new girlfriend whose smile never quite reached me, leaned into him, pleased. I didn't move. The gift felt ridiculous now. Paper crisp, ribbon straight, the weight of an old promise inside. The bourbon I'd picked up at the corner store on my way over, his favorite label, sweated in the paper bag under my arm. I could have said a dozen things. I could have asked him to step outside, to give me 5 minutes where we weren't performing for people who didn't know how long 28 years can be. I did none of that. At a certain point you learn that arguing with a crowd is a way of handing it the mic. I eased the paper bag onto the credenza so it wouldn't clink. The wrapped box I couldn't set down. It wasn't expensive as gifts go, but it wasn't a purchase either. It was the kind of thing that carried voices. My father's, quiet and proud, the day he gave it to me. My mother's, teasing him for being sentimental. It had spent years in a drawer because I'd told myself I'd know the right moment when it came. I'd been wrong. The balcony door opened and a wash of cold air shoved through the room. The city outside smelled like wet brick and faint exhaust. A winter storm dragged out longer than it needed to be. Ethan had turned away by then, already back in the orbit of his own party. He didn't look around to see if I would stay. He knew me well enough to know I would leave quietly. "Hey, Mr. Cole, right?" A man in a too-tight shirt and a haircut that tried too hard smiled a fraction too wide. "You're good? You need anything?" It wasn't kindness. It was optics. The sort of concern that floats on the surface so it doesn't get anything on it. "I'm good," I said, "because that's what you say." The hallway outside the apartment felt like a different country. Carpet-swallowing sound. the smear of city lights trapped in framed artwork of bridges and skylines. The door clicked behind me, and the music dulled to a throb inside the wall. I stood there long enough to feel the stiffness in my shoulders loosen, as if my bones had been bracing for a hit I hadn't admitted to. The elevator came with a soft chime, brass doors reflecting me back in dull gold, a man who looked like he'd stayed too long at a movie that stopped being funny. In the elevator, I could see my hands again. They were steady in a way that surprised me. I turned the box over once, thumb smoothing the edge of the ribbon. Inside was the old field watch my father had carried through job sites and hospital waiting rooms, and one long night when I was 9, and the dog went missing, and he walked the neighborhood with me for hours. "Some things are worth staying out in the cold for," he'd said, when we found that mutt at dawn under Mrs. Alvarez's porch. He'd given me the watch on my 21st birthday. "You'll know when to pass it on," he'd said then, and I thought he meant some ceremonial moment under perfect lighting. Maybe he'd meant the opposite. Maybe he'd meant you'd know when not to. The lobby was half light and marble, a security guard behind glass reading a paperback. He glanced up as I crossed and nodded in that easy way city guards do when they've seen everything. Outside, rain freckled the sidewalk, streetlights pulling long stripes across puddles. I didn't open an umbrella. I wanted the rain. I wanted the sting of it on my face to proof what had happened, to make it physical and not just something ugly lodged behind my ribs. There's a reel your mind plays when it wants to hurt you. I saw Ethan at 6, hair crushed under a Little League cap. The afternoon he finally hit the ball because I'd pitched them softer than the coach, and he needed to remember it was possible. I saw him at 19, jittery and brilliant after too much coffee, calling me from a clinic because he'd ignored a bill long enough for it to turn into a summons. I saw him at 23, moving back for a few months while he figured things out. Months that turned into a year, that turned into me signing a lease I didn't live in because the landlord was wary, and I sold myself on the idea that being a good father sometimes meant going second in your own life. Rationalizations are a language I'm fluent in. Tonight they went quiet. I walked without deciding where. The city sorted itself into the usual midnight chorus. Sirens, a bus groaning to a stop, a couple arguing just loud enough to prove a point they'd both regret later. A deli's neon buzzed, stubborn. The watch box went from heavy to simply present, like a fact. At the corner, I paused under the drip edge of an awning and looked back at the building I'd just left. 40 floors of light, some windows, bright squares, some dark. The whole thing a catalogue of people making choices and living with them. Somewhere up in that bright grid, my son was telling a story about me to people whose names I kept forgetting on purpose. I could feel the temptation to make this about pride. The cheap version of the story writes itself. Son humiliates father. Father storms out. Father declares himself done. But pride is loud and thin and burns off fast. What started to take shape in the rain wasn't pride. It was something colder and cleaner. A boundary, finally given weight. A line I should have drawn a decade ago and kept moving because I couldn't stand to watch him hit it. A cab knifed a puddle near the curb, sending a fan of dirty water up my pant leg. I laughed, breath pluming white. Of course, a city doesn't build you a stage for your big moments. It barely gives you a place to stand. I checked the time on the phone I'd slid into my coat pocket earlier and saw a string of texts from people who didn't matter to this, and none from the one person who did. The rain gathered under my collar and ran down my spine. I thought of the watch again, my father's hand on my shoulder, the way he used to clear his throat when he wanted to say something plain and decent without making a scene of it. Some things are worth staying out in the cold for. Some things aren't. I started walking again, The block ahead was longer than it looked, like time when you're waiting for a door to open. I passed a late-night florist breaking down buckets, petals, and stems swept into a grey pile that still smelled alive. I passed a kid at a bus stop in a hoodie, too thin for the weather, bouncing on his heels, breath fogging the glass behind him. I passed a bar where the windows lit up bodies moving like one animal, all heat and forgetfulness. I kept going because motion, right now, was the only thing that felt like a choice. At the next corner, a diner held its own weather. Warm air rolling out when the door opened, the bell chiming at arrivals, red vinyl booths shining with the polish of 1,000 small disasters. I pushed in and slid into a booth by the window. Water from my coat pooling into a dark oval on the seat. The waitress was the age of someone who'd seen more than one kind of midnight. She handed me a mug without asking, and poured coffee until it climbed to the lip. "You look like you need it black," she said. "Black's good," I said, and wrapped both hands around the heat. "You're bleeding," she added, pointing with the pot toward my knuckle. I hadn't noticed the cut. I must have nicked it on the ribbon earlier. A paper-thin slice. "Napkins are free." "It's nothing," I said. "Most of the worst things are until they're not," she said, topping off the mug on her way to a cop at the counter. It was the kind of line you pretend not to hear so you don't have to agree with it. I set the small box on the table. It looked like it belonged to a different movie than the one I was in. In the glass, I could see my reflection overlaid with the rain-blurred street. My face, older than I let it be most days, and the city doing what cities do, continuing. Outside, the walk signal blinked its white figure, and then the orange hand, a tiny parable about permission and refusal. Patterns, I thought, hearing my sister's voice from last Thanksgiving, quiet and exact. "You think you're saving him, Richie. You're saving him from knowing the ground is solid." The coffee did what coffee does, made my heart step a little quicker, brought the edges of things into finer focus. I slid a finger under the ribbon because I wanted to feel the resistance, and then didn't pull. That was a piece of the truth, too. I wasn't ready to open it or to put it away. The waitress hovered, saw the box, saw my hands, gave me the kind of look people give when they've been alive long enough to recognize a shape even when the picture isn't finished. "You want pie?" she asked. "Not really." "You want pie," she said, and left a slice of blueberry anyway. "Pay me if you eat it. Pay me if you don't. We all need choices." I ate 2 bites I couldn't taste, and left the fork balanced on the plate like a truce. Rain stitched the window with fine lines. A bus exhaled at the curb. A girl in a parka jogged past, laughing into a phone, the sound bright and temporary. If you asked me in that exact moment what I was going to do next, I would have told you I didn't know. That was true and not true. I didn't know the steps. I knew the direction. I reached for my phone and unlocked it without thinking. My contacts rolled by like a slot machine. Numbers I hadn't used in years. Names from old jobs, old favors, old versions of me. I stopped on one. I'd buried low on purpose. The way you put a tool in the back of a drawer, because you don't trust what you might build if it's close at hand. The name just sat there on the screen, ordinary and electric. The rain changed tempo, heavier against the glass, and the bell over the diner door chimed at someone else's story beginning. I took a breath like you do before stepping into cold water, and my thumb lowered toward the call button, as if it had its own mind. The city was slick with leftover rain, every surface shimmering like it had been polished for some reason I couldn't quite believe in. Streetlights painted the wet pavement in streaks of gold and red, reflections stretching toward the gutter like they were trying to escape. I stepped out of Ethan's building and let the heavy glass door fall shut behind me, its sound swallowed by the low hum of traffic. The gift was still in my coat pocket, light as an object, but heavier than anything else I carried. My shoes splashed through shallow puddles as I moved without any sense of where I was going, just the need to be away from the sound of his laughter bleeding through the walls. A taxi swerved to avoid a double-parked car, sending a sheet of dirty water up onto the sidewalk. It caught the cuff of my pants, and I almost laughed at the precision of the universe's timing. Of course it would. Of course tonight would make sure I carried a stain home. I turned down a side street where the air was cooler and quieter, trading the din of music and conversation for the hiss of tires over wet asphalt. The gift sat against my hip with every step, the ribbon still smooth, the paper uncreased, as if its contents were untouched by anything that had happened in that apartment. I thought of the watch inside, the one my father gave me when I turned 21. He'd pressed it into my hand after dinner, his eyes steady, his words plain. "You'll know when it's time to pass this on." I'd assumed he meant a moment filled with pride, maybe at a graduation or the birth of a child. I hadn't considered the possibility that the right time might arrive in the middle of a cold night, in the wake of a sentence meant to cut. It sat in the box now like a question I wasn't ready to answer. I turned another corner and passed the glowing window of a 24-hour laundromat. Inside, a row of machines churned steadily, their low hum almost comforting. A man in a grey hoodie sat on a plastic chair, head bent over his phone, a bag of quarters on his knee. The smell of warm detergent drifted out into the street, reminding me of late nights years ago when I'd washed Little League uniforms after Ethan fell asleep, the red dirt from the field bleeding into the rinse water. Back then, I'd believed that kind of devotion mattered, that it built something lasting. The memories came in pieces, stitched together by the rhythm of my steps. I saw Ethan at 17, pacing in the kitchen while I signed the check for his first car, the one he totaled 6 months later on a rainy night, not unlike this one. I saw him at 23, calling me from across the city because his landlord was threatening eviction and he just needed a little help until his next job came through. A job that never materialized. Every time I'd said yes. Every time I'd told myself it was temporary. That's what fathers do, right? Fill in the gaps until your kid can stand on his own. But the gaps had turned into canyons, and tonight he'd stood in front of his friends and told me to vanish. I found myself in front of a small diner I didn't remember ever seeing before. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a pink halo over the doorway. Inside, the booths were covered in cracked red vinyl, and the air smelled like coffee and something fried in oil hours ago. I slid into a booth by the window, my coat damp against the seat. A waitress with tired eyes and a notepad tucked into her apron pocket appeared beside me without preamble. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." My voice sounded strange in my own ears, low, edged with something I didn't want to name. She poured from a glass pot, the steam rising between us. "Pie's fresh if you want it. Blueberry." I shook my head. "Just the coffee." She gave me a look that said she'd seen plenty of men sitting alone with that exact tone in their voice. "Suit yourself," she said, and left me with the mug. I wrapped both hands around it, letting the heat soak into my palms. Outside, the rain picked up again, drawing faint lines across the glass. I thought about calling someone, my sister maybe, but the idea of explaining tonight made my shoulders ache. What would I even say? That my son had taken the stage at his own birthday and wished me out of his life like it was a joke worth sharing. that I'd stood there holding a gift meant to bridge years of quiet disappointment, only to feel the bridge collapse before I could take a step. The bell over the door chimed, and a man in a dark suit slipped inside, shaking rain from his sleeves. He glanced around before heading for the counter, his shoes squeaking against the floor. For a moment, I envied the simplicity of his night. Just another guy grabbing a late meal on his way home, no weight in his pocket, no voice in his head replaying the same sentence over and over. I took a sip of coffee, the bitterness settling against my tongue. The watchbox sat on the table now, its neat wrapping out of place in the dim light. I traced the edge of the ribbon with my thumb, thinking of the way my father had looked at me that night so many years ago. I'd wanted to believe I'd recognize the moment to pass it on. Maybe the truth was simpler. You know when the moment isn't right. I pulled my phone from my coat and scrolled through my contacts. Names blurred past, some I hadn't spoken to in years. My thumb hesitated over one, Victor Hale. We hadn't talked in almost a decade, not since he'd left the city to start his own law practice. The last time we spoke, it was about something I wanted to forget. But I remembered one thing clearly. Victor was the kind of man who got things done quickly, quietly, and without questions. I stared at his name on the screen while the rain tapped harder against the glass. The waitress passed by with a tray of plates, glancing at the box on my table but saying nothing. My reflection in the window looked back at me, older than I'd realized, eyes darker than they should be. I thought about Ethan's voice, the smirk on his face, the way Samantha had leaned into him, like they were sharing a private victory. I set the phone down beside the coffee, my fingers still resting on it. In the space between heartbeats, a shape started to form in my mind. Not pride, not spite, but something sharper. A plan. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to feel real. I looked at the watchbox one more time, then back at Victor's name. My hand moved without hesitation, and before I could think better of it, I pressed call. The line rang twice before Victor's voice came through, deep and steady, like it hadn't been almost a decade. "Cole?" he said, his tone half statement, half question. "It's me," I answered, unsure whether I meant it for him or myself. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the low murmur of voices in the background on his end, the clink of a glass set down. "I'm guessing this isn't a social call." "Not even close," I said. "You still handle contracts?" His voice sharpened. "Depends on the kind. You in trouble?" I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I was realizing the trouble I was in wasn't legal. It was personal, and that was harder to fix. "Not exactly. I need to end a lease. Fast. And I don't want it questioned." Victor gave a short laugh. "You always did like the clean way out." "I'm not looking for clean," I said quietly. "I'm looking for final." He caught the weight in my voice. "You at your place?" "No, downtown. A diner on 5th and Lark." "I know it. Stay put," he said. "Give me 20 minutes." When the call ended, I stared at my phone until the screen dimmed. 20 minutes in a diner at midnight can feel like an hour. I sipped my coffee, pushed the pie around the plate, and watched the rain smear the city into watercolors outside the window. My mind wasn't in the booth anymore. It was skipping across years, dragging out pieces I hadn't looked at in a while. I saw Ethan at 12, shoulders slumped at the kitchen table, while I tried to explain why we couldn't afford the private soccer camp his friends were going to. I'd stayed up nights juggling numbers, making phone calls, but it wasn't enough. He'd muttered, "You just don't try hard enough," and gone to his room. I told myself he didn't mean it. Kids say things. But the sentence stayed with me, stored in a drawer I thought I'd locked. Then I saw him at 20, pacing in the hospital corridor after that motorcycle crash. His arm was in a sling, but his voice was strong enough to argue with me about whether I'd replace the bike. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone could be so fragile and so unyielding in the same moment. I paid the bills, of course, told myself it was the last time. It never is the last time, not until you make it so. The door to the diner swung open, letting in a slice of cold air and the sharp scent of rain. Victor stepped in like he owned the place, shaking off his coat and scanning the room until his eyes landed on me. He looked older, but not by much. Gray at the temples, still broad-shouldered. The kind of presence that made people step aside without realizing they'd done it. He slid into the booth opposite me. "You look like hell," he said without ceremony. "I've had better nights." He glanced at the small box between us but didn't ask. "Tell me." I laid it out for him. The party, the sentence that cut, the years of paying for everything while being treated like a problem to solve instead of a person. I told him about the lease, my name on the dotted line, the apartment full of furniture I'd bought, the bills that came to my mailbox. I didn't mention the watch. That part was mine. When I finished, Victor leaned back, folding his arms. "You want him out. You want it airtight." "I want him to come back one day and find there's nothing to come back to," I said, surprising myself with the sharpness in my own voice. Victor studied me for a long moment. "You sure this isn't about pride?" "No," I said. "It's about survival." He nodded once. "The lease is under your name?" "Yes." "Good. That makes it easy." He reached into his coat and pulled out a slim leather folder. "We'll file a termination notice first thing in the morning. I know the property manager. He owes me." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "How soon can it be done?" 48 hours, maybe less if I push. But if you want it quiet, no chance for him to argue, you'll need him out of the picture while we do it." "That won't be a problem," I said. "He's got a habit of disappearing when there's a mess." "And there's going to be a mess." Victor gave me a look that was part approval, part warning. "Once we do this, you can't walk it back. He'll have nowhere to go unless he's been planning for it." "He hasn't," I said. We talked through the details, what notices needed to be signed, how to handle the utilities, even the fastest way to get the furniture removed. Victor was efficient, almost surgical. This was just another job to him. To me, it felt like the beginning of a life I'd been too afraid to imagine. When he left, the diner felt quieter. I paid my bill and stepped back into the rain, the cold biting through my coat. I walked without hurrying, letting the city unfold around me, the wet streets glinting under the streetlights. Halfway down the block, I heard it. A familiar laugh, just loud enough to cut through the sound of traffic. My stomach tightened before my mind caught up. I turned and saw Ethan across the street, leaning against the brick wall of a bar, a drink in hand, surrounded by 3 friends. Samantha was there too, her head tilted back in a laugh that didn't sound like it came from joy. They looked like the party had never ended, like the words he'd thrown at me earlier were just part of the evening's entertainment. As I stood there in the rain, watching him from the shadows, Victor's words echoed in my head. "Once we do this, you can't walk it back." And in that moment, I knew I wouldn't. I turned away, letting the night swallow me, and didn't look back, until a sudden crash of breaking glass and a shout split the air behind me. The sound of shattering glass rolled down the street like an alarm bell, followed by a chorus of voices, angry, panicked, amused. I turned in time to see a ripple of movement outside the bar, the glow from the neon beer signs spilling onto the wet pavement. A dark bottle lay in jagged pieces at the curb, foaming beer rushing toward the gutter. Ethan was at the center of it, his body language sharp and coiled, chest forward, jaw locked. Samantha clung to his arm, her smile gone now, replaced by the tight-lipped look of someone trying to keep a lid on something already boiling over. One of his friends, a guy in a leather jacket 2 sizes too small, was shouting at another man I didn't recognize, a wiry stranger with a red beanie pulled low. The two of them moved toward each other, that dangerous kind of slow, like animals gauging distance before the lunge. Ethan stepped between them, or maybe into it. It was hard to tell which. The rain slicked down his hair, glistening under the streetlights, and in the brief pause between shouts I could hear his voice, raised and sharp. I stayed in the shadows, close enough to see but not be seen, my coat collar turned up against the cold. The people spilling out of the bar seemed split between watching and walking away. The bystanders kept their distance, unwilling to get involved, but unwilling to miss the show. A door guy stood at the entrance, his massive arms folded, scanning the scene like he was calculating just how much he was being paid to care. Then it happened. Fast, the way these things do. The man in the red beanie shoved Ethan hard enough to stagger him backward. The leather jacket guy lunged, Samantha screamed, and someone else yelled, "Hey!" like that was going to slow anybody down. A second bottle hit the pavement, glass spraying in a half-moon under the streetlight. From where I stood, I could see the choice taking shape in Ethan's body. The shift in his shoulders, the way his hands curled into fists. He'd been here before. Different bars, different nights, different reasons, but always the same posture. That forward lean into a fight like it was a door he already knew how to walk through. By the time the bouncer moved in, it was too late. Ethan swung, wild and fast, his fist connecting with the red beanie's jaw. The man went down hard, catching himself with one hand on the wet sidewalk. Leather jacket guy was right behind, shoving someone else out of the way. It was a mess of limbs and shouting, and the sound of it was a mix of rage and alcohol, ugly and raw. Blue light flashed at the far end of the street, splintering the wet night into shards of red and blue. Sirens followed, low and rising, until the patrol car rounded the corner and slowed. The crowd thinned instantly, peeling off into doorways and side streets. The bouncer stepped back, hands up, already rehearsing whatever line he'd give the cops. I should have left. I should have turned away and let it play out without me. But I stayed, half hidden behind a newspaper box, watching the officers step out, one tall and broad, the other compact with a face like granite. They moved in with practiced precision, one taking the perimeter, while the other went straight for the knot of people still circling each other. "Enough!" the tall one barked, his voice carrying like a slammed door. Ethan froze for a heartbeat, then turned toward him with that cocky, sideways smile I'd seen him use on teachers, landlords, and just about every cop who'd ever pulled him over. It was his shield, that grin, meant to say, "I'm not a threat, we can work this out." Sometimes it even worked. Not tonight. The shorter officer was already asking questions, pointing at the broken bottles, the man on the ground rubbing his jaw, Samantha's frantic hands. People were talking over each other, the words blurring into a wall of noise. Then I heard it. Ethan's voice, too loud, too defensive. "I didn't start this," he said, stepping forward. "Ask anybody." "That's enough," the tall officer cut in, hand up. Ethan kept going. "This guy came at me, I was just—" The officer stepped closer, and in the space between their shoulders I saw it. The way Ethan's eyes darted, looking for the edge he could talk himself onto. But the tall one wasn't buying it. A moment later, the handcuffs were out, the metal glinting under the streetlight. Samantha's voice cut sharp through the air. "What are you doing?" "He didn't—" The officer ignored her. "Turn around, sir." I felt the old reflex kick in. the urge to step forward, to smooth it over, to throw myself between him and whatever wall he was about to hit. But I didn't move. I just watched, my hands shoved deep in my pockets, as he argued and twisted until the click of the cuffs snapped the night into silence. The shorter officer guided him toward the patrol car, his head ducked now, rain dripping off his hair. Samantha trailed behind, still protesting, her voice cracking at the edges. The man in the red beanie had been moved to the curb, an ice pack pressed to his jaw, a cop's notepad balanced on his knee. The whole thing took less than 5 minutes. Then the door of the patrol car closed, the siren stayed off, and they pulled away slow, like there was no rush. I stood there until the taillights vanished, my breath clouding in the damp air. I knew then that Victor's 48-hour window had just opened wider, and for the first time all night, I let myself smile, because Ethan wasn't coming home any time soon. The rain had thinned to a mist by the time I made it back to my apartment, that fine, drifting kind that clings to your skin but never quite soaks you. I hung my coat on the hook by the door, the damp fabric heavy in my hand, and stood in the quiet for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. The city hummed faintly beyond the window, a sound that's equal parts comfort and warning. I didn't bother with the television. I didn't bother with the lights. I just sat at the kitchen table, the small watch box resting in front of me like an anchor. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. It was Victor. "Your timing's perfect," he said without preamble. "I heard from a guy at Precinct 9. Your son's in holding. Drunk and disorderly. Possible assault. He'll be processed overnight." I felt the shift in my chest, somewhere between relief and something darker. "How long do I have?" "They'll arraign him tomorrow. If the other guy presses charges, he could sit for a few days, maybe longer, but we should move now. Tonight." I glanced at the clock. Almost 1 in the morning. "Tell me what you need." Victor's voice stayed calm, businesslike. "Keys to the apartment. Any documentation? Lease, receipts, proof the utilities are in your name. I'll handle the notice to vacate first thing. By the time he's out, the locks will be changed." I slid open the drawer by the fridge and pulled out the spare keys. "I'll meet you in 30. The streets were nearly empty when I drove over, the wet pavement catching the glow from the streetlights. I parked a block away from Ethan's building, the way you do when you don't want your car remembered. Victor was already there, leaning against his sedan with a folder under one arm and a thermos in the other hand. He didn't ask how I was feeling. That was part of why I'd called him. "Let's make it quick," he said, taking the keys. We moved through the lobby without attracting attention. The night concierge was slumped behind the desk, earbuds in, eyes on a tablet. I don't think he even noticed us. Upstairs, the hallway was silent. Victor unlocked the door, and we stepped into the apartment Ethan had been calling his for the last year. It was a mess, but not the kind you clean in an afternoon. Takeout boxes stacked by the sink, beer bottles lined like trophies on the counter, a sweatshirt crumpled in the middle of the floor. I stood there for a long moment, taking in the smell of stale beer and cologne that clung to everything. This was the space I'd been paying for, month after month, telling myself it was temporary. Victor was already moving, checking rooms, making notes on a small pad. "I'll have a cleaning crew in here tomorrow morning. Movers by the afternoon. Anything you want to keep?" I looked around. There were a few things I recognized. My old leather armchair in the corner, a set of dishes I'd bought when he first moved in. But most of it felt foreign to me, like I'd stepped into a stranger's life. "The chair," I said finally, "and the photo album in his bedroom closet." Victor nodded. "Everything else goes to storage. He can deal with it from there." We worked in silence for the next hour. I boxed up the few items I wanted, while Victor handled the paperwork, leaving copies of the termination notice in plain view on the kitchen counter. When we were done, the apartment looked the same, but it felt different, emptied in some invisible way, the air heavier with what was about to happen. On the way out, Victor locked the door and handed me back the keys. Tomorrow, I'll have the locks changed. Utilities cut. Internet disconnected. By the time he's out, he'll find a stranger's door here. Good, I said. My voice didn't waver. Driving home, I thought about all the times I'd been the one to bail him out, literally and otherwise. I thought about the hospital visits, the late-night calls, the rent payments. And I thought about tonight, standing in the rain while he swung at another man like it was sport, as if consequences were just things that happened to other people. This time, the consequences would wait for him at home. I pulled into my driveway just as my phone buzzed again. It was a text from Victor. He's not getting out tomorrow. Assault charge stuck. That gives us 3 days, maybe more. 3 days. Enough time to make sure there was nothing left for him to come back to. I stared at the message until the screen went dark, the reflection of my own face staring back at me. And for the first time, I wondered if I'd be able to watch his face when he realized what I'd done. By the next morning, the clouds had thinned, and the city was waking with that cautious quiet that follows a night of too much rain. I'd barely slept, not because I was second-guessing myself, but because my mind kept running through the order of the next few days like a well-rehearsed play. Victor's text was still fresh in my phone. 3 days, maybe more. Enough time to dismantle everything Ethan thought was permanent. I met Victor outside the building at 8 sharp. He was dressed like it was any other workday. Dark suit, leather gloves, no wasted motion in the way he carried himself. Behind him, a box truck idled at the curb, the logo of a moving company I didn't recognize painted in faded red along its side. 2 men in work boots stood beside it, sipping coffee from paper cups, waiting for a signal. "Everything's set," Victor said. "Locksmith's on the way. Movers know what's staying and what's going. By sunset, this place will look like no one's ever lived here." We went inside together. The concierge was different this time, a young woman who didn't ask questions when Victor showed a printed work order. The elevator ride up felt longer than usual, the silence between us filled with the low groan of the cables and the faint hum of the motor. When the doors opened, the apartment door loomed at the end of the hall. Victor unlocked it, and the smell hit me first. Stale beer, unwashed laundry, the faint chemical tang of cheap cologne. It was the kind of smell you don't notice when you live in it, but it punches you in the face when you've been away. The movers filed in, efficient and silent. They started with the living room, stacking the beer bottles into garbage bags, breaking down the cheap shelving that bowed under the weight of clutter. I watched as they carried out box after box of things Ethan had probably forgotten he owned. Victor moved through the place like an inspector, checking off each room on a list. "Utilities are set to shut down tonight," he said. "Internet and cable cancelled. Anything with your name on it is gone by tomorrow." In Ethan's bedroom, the movers worked around piles of clothes on the floor, some still in shopping bags with the tags on. I found the photo album I'd mentioned the night before, wedged between a pair of old sneakers and a box of tangled phone chargers. I opened it briefly. Pictures of a boy with scraped knees, birthday cakes with uneven frosting, summer days at the lake. I shut it before I could fall into the pull of it, and slid it into my own bag. By midday, the apartment was stripped down to its bones. The leather chair I'd claimed sat in the hallway, wrapped in moving blankets. The rest of the furniture was loaded onto the truck or left for the cleaning crew that would arrive in an hour. The echo in the rooms was unsettling, each footstep sounding sharper than it should. The locksmith showed up right on schedule, a wiry man with a toolbox and a quick smile. "Standard deadbolt replacement?" he asked. "Make it better than standard," Victor said before I could answer. "We don't want anyone getting clever with a spare key." The man nodded and set to work, the metallic clicks and turns of his tools filling the air. I stood by the window, looking down at the street where the box truck was pulling away, and imagined Ethan walking up the sidewalk in a few days, pulling out his key, expecting everything to be exactly as he left it. The thought didn't bring me joy. It brought something closer to resolve. When the locksmith was done, he handed Victor the new keys. Victor passed one to me. "This is yours. The other stays with me until we hand it over to the new tenant." "New tenant?" I asked. He gave me a thin smile. "I don't waste time." By late afternoon, the cleaning crew had arrived, armed with industrial vacuums and buckets of disinfectant. Victor and I stood in the hallway, watching them work through the open door. The stale smell was already fading, replaced by the sharp scent of lemon cleaner. "You sure you want to be here when it's done?" Victor asked. "Yes," I said. "I want to see it empty." An hour later, I got my wish. The apartment was spotless, the air neutral, the only sound the low hum of the fridge. A fridge that would be unplugged before the night was over. It didn't look like Ethan's place anymore. It didn't look like mine either. It looked like a blank slate. Victor locked the door, tested it twice, and we walked back to the elevator. In the lobby, the young concierge glanced up from her desk but didn't speak. Outside, the sun was setting behind the buildings, the light fractured into gold and shadow. Victor stopped beside his car. "This is the point of no return," he said. "Once the listing goes live tomorrow, there's no walking this back." "I know," I said. We shook hands, and he got into his car. I stood there for a moment longer, watching the traffic roll past, feeling the weight of the new key in my pocket. I thought about how quickly a home can stop being one. When I finally turned to leave, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Heard you've been busy. We should talk before Ethan finds out." The number sat on my phone screen like a pebble in my shoe, small but impossible to ignore. I didn't recognize it, but the message was deliberate. Someone knew enough to know what I'd been doing, and they weren't bluffing. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying and focused on the day ahead. The plan wasn't changing. The next morning, I met Victor at the storage facility on the edge of town. It was the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you needed it. Long, low buildings in faded paint, rows of metal doors the color of storm clouds, and the faint smell of motor oil baked into the concrete. The manager, a heavy-set man with a sunburned neck, checked Victor's ID and handed over the keys to a unit in the far corner. Inside, our movers had stacked Ethan's life in uniform rows, boxes labeled with black marker, his mattress wrapped in plastic, the couch turned on its side. I stood in the doorway, taking it in. All of it looked smaller here, diminished. Without the walls of that apartment to give them context, the things were just things. Cheap furniture, electronics I'd paid for, clothes bought on a whim. The kind of stuff that could belong to anyone. The photo album in my own house felt heavier than all of it combined. 3 months paid in advance, Victor said, locking the unit. After that, if he doesn't claim it, they auction it off. I nodded. Let him figure it out. From there, we headed to the building for the final sweep. The hall smelled faintly of lemon cleaner now, a lingering echo of the cleaning crew. The door to the apartment opened smoothly under the new lock, and the place greeted us with silence. The fridge had been unplugged. The cupboards were bare. The floors shone under the overhead lights. Victor did one last walk-through, checking each room, opening closets, making sure nothing had been overlooked. I followed behind, my shoes clicking in the emptiness. I couldn't stop picturing Ethan walking through these rooms the last time he'd been here, dropping his jacket over a chair, kicking off his shoes, moving like the place belonged to him. That image had been erased now. The blank walls didn't remember him. In the living room, Victor pulled a plain white envelope from his briefcase and set it on the counter. Lease termination notice, dated and signed. This is what you show anyone who asks. I stared at it for a moment before pulling out my own envelope, the one with my handwriting, the one I'd been working on for days. Inside was the short, sharp note I'd decided would be the only explanation Ethan would get. I set it beside Victor's, imagining the moment he'd pick it up, his fingers hesitating before opening it. The locksmith stopped by again to install a secondary latch, the kind you couldn't open without being inside. By the time he left, the door was more secure than my own home. In the afternoon, Victor met a young woman from the building's leasing office. She had a clipboard and the brisk efficiency of someone used to turning over units without asking too many questions. "We've already got a list of interested tenants," she said, glancing around. "This location, this square footage, it won't sit empty for long." "That's the idea," Victor told her. She smiled politely, took the keys from him, and left without ever looking at me. For a moment, I was grateful for her detachment. When the door closed behind her, Victor looked at me. "That's it. You're out. He's out. By the time he's released, this place will be someone else's problem." The words landed heavier than I expected. This wasn't just a transaction anymore. It was a line in the sand, one I'd already crossed. I locked the door and walked with Victor back to the elevator. The ride down was quiet, the air thick with the smell of fresh paint from some other unit. In the lobby, I shook his hand. "Thanks," I said. "Don't thank me yet," he replied. "Wait until it's over." Outside, the late afternoon light was turning the buildings gold at the edges. I started toward my car, feeling the weight of the last 3 days settle in my chest. The key to the apartment was gone from my pocket. The last tie was cut. My phone buzzed as I opened the car door. Same unknown number. This time just 2 words. "He knows." The message burned on the screen longer than it should have. "He knows." Just 2 words, unsigned, from the same number that had been baiting me since yesterday. I sat in the driver's seat with the door still open, letting the street noise wash over me, while I weighed what those words could mean. Ethan was still in custody. I'd confirmed that myself an hour ago, so if he knew, it wasn't from seeing it firsthand. Someone had told him, which meant there was a leak in a process that had been airtight until now. I closed the door and drove aimlessly for a while, letting the turns choose themselves. The city looked different when your mind was somewhere else. Traffic lights changed without me noticing. Pedestrians floated past like background actors. I ended up in front of my own place, parking under the slant of a street lamp. Inside, the air was still, holding on to the faint smell of coffee from the morning. I set my phone on the counter and stared at it as if the next buzz would explain everything. When it came, it wasn't a text. It was a call from Victor. "You get the same message I did?" he asked without greeting. "Yes," I said. "Any idea who it's from?" "Could be Samantha," he said. "Could be one of his friends. Could be he made a call from inside. It doesn't matter. He can't change anything from where he is." I wanted to believe him. Still, I don't like him knowing before it's done. Victor sighed. "It is done. The lease is terminated, the locks are changed, and the place is already being shown to new tenants. You can't unring that bell." We hung up, but his words didn't settle the knot in my chest. I went to my desk and pulled open the drawer where the envelope sat, the one I'd left on the counter in the apartment. my handwriting firm and deliberate across the front. In my mind, I could see him finding it, fingers hesitating before breaking the seal. I read it again, the 40 words I'd trimmed down from pages of drafts. You told me to disappear from your life. I'm granting your wish. The apartment is gone. I'm gone. You have the independence you wanted. Use it wisely. No explanations, no apologies. Just the truth he'd asked for. The next morning, I drove back to the building under the guise of checking the mail one last time. The leasing office door was open, and I could see a young couple touring the unit with the building manager. They moved from room to room, the woman pausing to run her fingers along the window frame, the man testing the light switches. It was strange, watching strangers inhabit what had, for a year, been the stage for so many of my worst moments with Ethan. The manager caught my eye through the doorway and gave a polite nod before continuing her pitch. I stayed in the hallway until they left, then stepped inside. The space was stripped clean of any trace of him. Even the scuff mark, near the baseboard where he used to kick off his shoes, was gone. The envelope was still on the counter, untouched. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it. I'd imagined him opening it in this room, letting the words land in the same air where so much had been said between us. But he wasn't going to see it here. Not now. I picked it up, felt the weight of the paper between my fingers, and slid it into my coat pocket. Back in the car, I turned the envelope over in my hands at every stoplight. Delivering it was no longer about theater. It was about making sure it reached him before someone else twisted the story. I didn't want Samantha telling him I'd sold his things or thrown them away. I wanted him to know the exact truth, that I'd simply removed myself from the role he'd been casting me in. That afternoon, I called the precinct and confirmed his arraignment was scheduled for the following morning. Bail was unlikely to be posted before noon. That gave me time. I drove to the storage unit, unlocked it, and found the smallest box, one of the first the movers had packed. Inside was a framed photo of him at 7, missing a tooth, holding a baseball bat. I slipped the photo out of the frame, folded the envelope around it, and resealed it with tape from the desk in the manager's office. That night I barely slept, my mind replaying every version of how he might react. Anger, disbelief, maybe even silence. By sunrise, the city outside my window was already moving, and so was I. I drove to the jail, the envelope tucked inside my jacket, and signed in at the front desk. The officer on duty didn't ask questions. "We'll make sure he gets it," she said, slipping the envelope into a bin marked for inmate property. I walked back out into the pale light, my breath visible in the morning air. I didn't linger. There was nothing else to do but wait. But halfway to my car, my phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. This time the message was longer. "He's getting out tomorrow, and he's coming straight to you." The message replayed in my mind with every turn of the wheel. "He's getting out tomorrow, and he's coming straight to you." I drove without the radio, without even the hum of a phone call to break the silence. The city outside was its usual late-morning rush. Delivery vans double-parked, pedestrians crossing on the red, steam rising from manhole covers. But it all felt like background noise to the thrum in my chest. Tomorrow had been an abstract date for weeks, a marker on the calendar I'd been steering toward in careful, measured moves. Now it was the edge of the cliff, and I could already feel the drop. At home, I set my keys on the counter and sat down at the kitchen table. The chair felt harder than usual. My coffee had gone cold before I even took the first sip. I tried to picture the scene. Ethan walking into the lobby, maybe still wearing the same clothes from the night of the arrest, heading for the elevator like nothing had changed. The key would fail in his hand, the lock refusing him, and in that moment the truth would land like a brick. But that was before I knew he'd been warned. The thought of him knowing, of him walking toward me with that look, the one that always carried a little smirk at the corners, made my stomach tighten. I'd faced him before in anger, but never when I was the one who'd set the match to the fuse. By noon, I'd called Victor. "Not a surprise," he said flatly. "You knew this was coming." "I didn't know he'd be warned ahead of time," I said. "It doesn't change the endgame," he told me. "You've done what you needed to do. Now it's just about managing the exit." "Managing the exit," I repeated, the words tasting like metal in my mouth. That afternoon, I drove to the storage unit. The air inside was cool and dry, smelling faintly of cardboard and dust. I unlocked the door and stepped in, scanning the rows of boxes. Everything was here. His life reduced to neat stacks, labeled in black marker. It should have made me feel in control, but instead there was a weight to it. The chair was against the back wall, swaddled in blankets, the one piece I'd kept for myself, sitting like a sentinel in the quiet. I left without touching anything. By evening, the sky had turned the color of slate, and the street lamps flickered on early. I couldn't shake the sense that I needed to move, to put space between me and whatever tomorrow might bring. I called my neighbor, Frank, under the pretense of borrowing something, but what I really wanted was to see if he'd notice if I slipped a bag into his guest room. Frank opened the door in a flannel shirt, the smell of something cooking drifting out behind him. "You all right?" he asked. "Just might be heading out of town for a couple days," I said. "Something to do with Ethan?" I didn't answer right away. "Yeah, something to do with Ethan." He didn't press. That was one of the things I liked about Frank. He understood that sometimes silence was the better part of friendship. Back home, I packed a small duffel, essentials only, clothes for a few days, the photo album, the watch box. I left the rest. The house felt different once it was done, like it was already in the rearview mirror. I sat in the living room with the lights low, watching the shadows stretch across the floor. My phone lay on the table, screen down, as if that could stop it from delivering another message I didn't want. When it did buzz, the sound was louder than it should have been in the quiet. I turned it over, same number. One line this time. "He says he's not coming to talk." I stared at it, the words reshaping themselves in my head until they fit the only truth they could mean. He wasn't coming to talk. He was coming for something else. The next morning broke pale and brittle, the kind of winter light that makes everything look sharper than it should. I'd been awake since before dawn, lying still in the dark, listening to the slow creaks of the house settling and the occasional car passing on the wet road outside. Every sound made my chest tighten, as if I were waiting for the knock, even before he was free to come. I made coffee I didn't drink, pacing from the kitchen to the living room and back again. The phone stayed on the counter, screen up, a silent referee between what I'd already done and what was about to happen. Around 9, I got the call from a number I didn't recognize. It was the desk officer at the precinct. "Ethan Cole was released at 8:47 this morning," she said, her voice as flat as if she were reading the weather. "He signed for his property and left on foot." "Did he—" I stopped myself. It didn't matter what he'd said or if he'd asked about me. I just thanked her and hung up. I stood at the window, watching the street. The air outside had the gray stillness that comes before snow, though the forecast had promised none. People passed in twos and threes, bundled against the cold. Somewhere in the distance, a truck backfired, and my body reacted before my mind caught up. It was almost noon when I decided I couldn't just sit here. I grabbed my coat and walked the 3 blocks to Ethan's old building. The lobby was warm and smelled faintly of polish, the same as it had every other time I'd been here. The concierge, new since my last visit, gave me a polite smile but didn't recognize me. I didn't go upstairs. Instead, I stood near the mailboxes, waiting. It wasn't long before the elevator doors opened and a young woman stepped out, a set of new keys jingling in her hand. She wore a thick scarf and had the bright, eager expression of someone still in the honeymoon phase of moving in. "Hi," I said, careful to keep my tone neutral. "Are you the new tenant?" She nodded, shifting the grocery bag on her shoulder. "Moved in yesterday. You looking for someone?" "No," I said quickly. "Just used to know the person who lived here before." "Oh." She glanced toward the hallway, then back at me. "Well, it's a great place. I'm really happy with it." I wished her well and stepped outside before she could ask me anything else. The cold bit at my face as I crossed the street to the coffee shop on the corner. From the window seat, I had a clear view of the front entrance. I didn't have to wait long. A little after 1, I saw him. Ethan walked fast, shoulders hunched against the wind, wearing the same jacket he'd been arrested in. His hair was longer than I remembered, unkempt, and there was a rawness to his face. Anger, fatigue, I couldn't tell. He didn't notice me. I watched as he pushed through the glass doors into the lobby, striding straight to the elevator. The concierge said something to him, but he didn't slow. He vanished into the elevator, and I sat there with my hands wrapped around the coffee I still hadn't touched. Minutes later, the elevator doors opened again on the lobby security camera, mounted in the corner, angled toward the front desk. Ethan stepped out, slower this time. The smirk was gone. He spoke to the concierge, gesturing sharply toward the hallway, then toward the door. The concierge shook his head. Ethan's movements grew sharper, more erratic. Then he stormed outside. From my seat, I saw him scan the street like a man looking for someone specific. For a moment, I thought his eyes locked on mine through the window. But then they slid past, searching the rest of the block. He pulled his phone from his pocket, stabbed at the screen, and pressed it to his ear. My own phone buzzed a second later. Unknown number. I didn't answer. He stood there for another 30 seconds, pacing, jaw working, before shoving the phone back in his pocket. Then he started walking, fast, purposeful, away from the building and down the street. I watched him until he disappeared around the corner, my pulse hammering in my ears. I knew exactly where that street led, straight toward my house. I left the coffee shop the second he turned the corner and took the long way home, cutting behind the grocery and along the alley that runs parallel to my street. The cold worked its way under my collar and found the hinge of my jaw. Every few steps I looked back, not because I thought he'd see me, but because something old in me still wanted to know where he was. It's a hard reflex to kill, the one that counts your child's footsteps, even when the only thing you can do with that count is brace. My house looked the same as it always does in winter. Stoop swept, porch light off in the day, the camellia by the steps holding onto a handful of stubborn blossoms. I slipped inside, left the door unlatched, and stood in the narrow hall with my hand flat against the wood, as if I could feel the street through it. The place was quiet enough to hear the clock in the dining room, to hear the radiator pop when it remembered its job. I took off my coat, set it on the back of a chair, and didn't bother with the coffee I'd abandoned that morning. A different heat was rising in me now, not anger exactly, not fear, something more focused and clean, the feeling you get when the final step of a plan is the only thing left. It didn't take him long. The footsteps came up the walk too fast, the way you walk when you've been shoving your way through other plans all day, and you're done with asking. The doorknob turned hard and useless. Then the first knock, open-handed, loud enough to carry. Not yet the kind that says, "I'm coming in either way." I let it sit there between us, the sound working through the wood and the small bones of my ear. The second knock came faster, impatient. "Dad," he called, voice wheeled thin by the cold and whatever else the last 48 hours had carved out of him. "Open the door." I did. He stood on the porch with winter on his jacket and the jail still ghosting the lines of his face. Same clothes as yesterday, hair flattened by a pillow no one changed, wrists marked by metal. He didn't look small, he never did, but something in his posture had lost its bluff. His eyes flicked past me into the hallway like he was checking inventory. "Inside," he said, brushing past before I moved. The word wasn't a request. It used to work on me when he was 9 and trying on power. It didn't now. He stopped halfway down the hall and turned, surprised that I hadn't followed. "This is my house," I said. "You don't walk in front of me." He swallowed, some quick calculation moving across his face, and took a half step back the way a boxer does when the other man doesn't fold on schedule. "Fine," he said. Can we talk?" He'd said he wasn't coming to talk, but the sentence wore different clothes in daylight. He stood there rubbing the heel of his hand against his jaw, a habit he didn't know he had, and for a second I saw him at 7 again, chin up, trying not to cry over a scraped knee. It's a dangerous second. It can undo months. "You changed the locks," he said, switching gears without warning. "You terminated the lease." His mouth curled around the word like it was a taste he couldn't spit out. "They told me some new girl moved in. My key doesn't work anywhere." "Your key never worked anywhere. It wasn't given," I said. "You just got used to doors opening." He stared. "Where is my stuff?" "In storage. 3 months paid. After that, it's on you." "On me." He laughed, and the sound had no air in it. "On me? Yeah, okay." He took a step closer. "Who told you to do this, huh? Victor? That fossil always liked telling people how to live. Did Samantha call you? What? Did she give you some story about me using her? Everyone's got a story when I'm not in the room." "This isn't about Samantha," I said. "It's not about Victor. It's about me finally treating myself like a person you don't get to use." He looked past me again, toward the kitchen, toward the hallway that ends in the back door. I watched the old map in his head redraw itself and come up blank. He wasn't used to not finding what he wanted in my house. He pulled a crumpled envelope from his jacket, the one I'd left at the jail. The seal was split ragged, tape slashed with a thumb. He held it up with 2 fingers, like it was evidence. "This," he said, shaking it once. 40 words like a press release. "You think that's funny? You think that's... what? Wise? I think it's all that's left. You sold my home. It was never your home. It was a place I paid for. Homes come with work." His mouth went tight. "You did it while I was locked up. You told a room full of people you wanted me gone. I believed you." Something broke in his face then. Not a crack you could see. Not something theatrical. Just a small shift, the way a tree makes a sound before it falls. His shoulders, went from squared to a little rounded, like the jacket weighed more than it had when he walked up my steps. He didn't drop the envelope, but his hand loosened. He looked like he wanted somewhere to put it down, and nothing in the house would take it. "I was mad," he said, finally softer. "People say things. You've been saying them for years." He nodded once, a jerk, then shook his head like agreeing cost him. He glanced at the floor, then back at me. "You know what they said when they gave me my property?" They said, "You got any place to go?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Yeah, because there's always been some place to go. There's always been you." The last word came out with more room around it than I expected. "And now?" He pressed the heel of his hand to his eye, hard enough to leave a red crescent when he dropped it. "Now it's a girl I don't know living in my apartment and a storage locker number on a receipt and a letter that reads like you're subscribing me to a magazine I didn't ask for." "Independence isn't a subscription," I said. "It's a job. You either show up or it fires you." He flinched, not from the words but from recognizing them. They were something I'd said to him when he dropped out of his second job in as many months, years ago. He'd mocked me for it then, turning it into a punchline for friends who liked jokes with convenient villains. He wasn't laughing now. He tried one more door. "Just let me crash here. 2 days. I'll get something lined up. You don't have to cook for me. You don't have to. Just 2 days." I thought about it. That's the truth. I let the request sit in the room and do what it does, which is summon every picture of every other time 2 days had been the price of a year. I saw the couch I'd bought him and the chair I'd kept for myself. Saw the stack of dishes he'd let mold, because being cared for had always trumped caring. I saw myself in February, next February, the one after that, still holding the door open for a man who has learned the shape of my shoulder so well he no longer notices when he leans. "No," I said, because the alternative was a future I had already lived. He laughed again, but it was small. "You can't do this." I already did. He put his hand on the banister like he needed the wood. For a second I thought he was going to push past me and try the rooms anyway. He didn't. He looked down the hall, then at me, then past me to the front door, and the slice of grey day shoulder width wide beyond it. "I don't have anywhere to go," he said, not as a threat, not as a tactic, just as a sentence that finally understood itself. "That's where you start," I said. And I meant it like a blessing, and like a boundary both. Something in him gave. Not dramatically. He didn't collapse or make a scene. He did what gravity does when the math changes. He sat on the bottom step with both feet on the floor, elbows on his knees, head bowed the way a runner bows when he is deciding whether to stand again. He held the envelope in both hands and stared at it like it might tell him a different story if he read it enough times. "I messed this up," he said, voice gone to gravel. "I know you want me to admit it. Fine. I messed it up." He scrubbed his palms over his face and let them drop. "But you didn't have to flip the whole board." "I didn't flip it," I said. "I finally stopped holding it still." He nodded like he heard it and hated it. People hate the clean lines most when they cut neat. He looked up, and the eyes were his and mine both. "Can I?" He swallowed. "Can I at least have the address to the storage? I need to know I'm not vapor." I pulled the claim ticket from my wallet and set it on the newel post. He reached up and took it without standing, like asking the house permission to move that much. He read the numbers. Twice, then folded it into the envelope and slid both into his jacket. He stood, finally. When he lifted his gaze, there was that flash, the old anger sparking through the new ash. "This isn't over," he said. But the way he said it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like homework. "It is for me," I said. He worked his mouth as if there were words he wanted that wouldn't line up. He looked at the kitchen again, at the living room with its framed pictures that stopped before the last 5 years, at the hallway full of doorways he no longer gets to claim. Then he pulled the front door half open, and a draft pulled through the house like a long breath. He stepped onto the porch, 1 foot on wood, 1 on concrete, caught between my threshold and the sidewalk that didn't care who he was. He turned back. "If I leave, you won't let me back in." "That's the point," I said. I wasn't unkind when I said it, and that kindness cost me. He studied me a last time, like he wanted to memorize the version of me that would not move. Then he went down the steps, 1, 2, 3, and sat on the bottom one again because the sidewalk beat him faster than he expected. He put his hands on either side of his knees and stared at the space between his shoes until his shoulders started to shake. Not sobbing, not the old wet anger, just the tremor of a system resetting under strain. I stood just inside my door with my hand on the edge of it and watched my son meet the ground I'd been raising under him for years. Across the street, Frank's curtain moved and stilled. A car went by without slowing. Somewhere 2 blocks over, a siren wound up and unspooled. I stepped back from the door and let it fall most of the way closed. Nothing but a hand's width left, enough to hear him breathe and not enough to call it company. In the narrow dark of the hall, the suitcase I'd packed last night waited against the wall, quiet as the kind of choice that changes the shape of your days. I picked it up by the handle and felt the watch box shift inside, a small thud, like a heart deciding. And when I turned off the porch light and reached for my keys, his knuckles rapped the wood 1 more time, 3 times, soft, like he finally remembered how to knock. The 3 knocks were so soft, they might have been an accident, like his hand had forgotten the difference between the door and his knee. I didn't answer, not right away. I stood in the narrow hallway, suitcase in one hand, keys in the other, feeling the weight of what was on the other side of that wood. For years, that weight had been mine to carry, to balance, to keep from tipping over. Now it wasn't. Now it was his. When I opened the door, he was still sitting on the bottom step, elbows on his knees, chin tucked down. He looked up like light had caught him off guard. "You leaving?" he asked, his voice more tired than curious. "Yes," I said. "I told you. This was the end." He nodded, slow, like he was trying to make that sentence fit somewhere in his head. "You going far?" "Far enough." For a moment, I thought he might ask to come, the way his eyes flicked to the suitcase, the way his mouth opened and closed again without sound. Those were the same small tells I'd seen when he was a boy, asking for something he knew I didn't want to give. But he didn't. Instead, he looked past me into the house, scanning the rooms he'd once walked through like they were his own. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just looking. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," he said finally. "You start with today," I told him. "Then you do the next one." "That's it?" "That's it." It wasn't enough for him. I could see that. But it was all I had to give. I stepped past him, locking the door behind me. The click was sharper than I meant it to be. We stood there for a few seconds on the porch, not quite facing each other. The air was cold and still, the kind of winter quiet that carries every sound. Down the block, a delivery truck rattled over a pothole, and somewhere a dog barked once and stopped. "I'm not saying I forgive you," he said. "I'm not asking you to," I replied. "Forgiveness isn't the point." He flinched a little, then shoved his hands deep into his jacket pockets. "You're not coming back, are you?" "No." I started down the steps, the suitcase wheels bumping against the wood. When I reached the sidewalk, I turned once, just enough to see him still standing on the porch. He looked taller than I remembered, not because he'd grown, but because I'd finally stopped leaning down to meet him. Frank's front door opened a crack, his eyes flicking between the two of us. I gave him a small nod, the kind that says, "I'm fine. Don't step in." He nodded back and disappeared inside. I loaded the suitcase into the trunk of the car. The watch box slid against the side with a muffled thud. I'd thought about leaving it for Ethan, but it wasn't time yet. Some things are only given when they can be carried. He wasn't there. Maybe he'd get there. Maybe not. As I got behind the wheel, he finally came down the steps. Not fast, not with any kind of drama. Just walking toward me like a man walking toward a question he didn't want to ask. I rolled down the window before he could knock on it. "Dad," he said. And the word hung there, softer than I'd heard it in years. "When you said you're gone, does that mean for good?" I looked at him for a long moment. Really looked. The way you do when you're memorizing something you know might be the last. "It means I'm not living your life for you anymore." He nodded once, stepped back, and shoved his hands deeper into his pockets. No goodbye. Just space between us, wider than the street. I rolled the window up, put the car in gear, and pulled away. In the rearview mirror, he was still standing there, the porch light catching in the creases of his jacket, making him look older than he should. The road out of town was empty, the sky a flat sheet of grey pressing down on the horizon. I didn't know where I'd stop first. That was the point. 5 miles out, my phone buzzed in the passenger seat. Unknown number again. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some instinct made me pick it up. "Dad," his voice came through, raw and unsteady. "There's something I need to tell you before you go any further. If this story struck a chord with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in my shoes? Share your take in the comments below, because your perspective matters here. And if you don't want to miss the next twist-filled, heart-gripping story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join me for the journey ahead.